Good morning. My name is Kate Dudley-Logue, Vice President of Community Outreach with the Ontario Autism Coalition. We are joined here today by MPP Chandra Pasma, Education Critic for the NDP, David Lepofsky, Chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with the Disabilities Act Alliance, and Laura Walton, President of the Ontario Federation of Labour. The Ontario Autism Coalition conducted a survey last summer asking families of students with special education needs about their children's experiences at school during the 2023-2024 school year. We asked key questions about safety, placements, academic support, exclusions, and individual education plans. The findings reveal significant gaps in resources, policies, and funding that highlight a special education system under significant strain. For years, the Coalition has been attempting to shine a light on these issues. We've met with politicians, policymakers, and other advocacy groups, all in an attempt to bring about positive change so that students with disabilities can access a meaningful, safe, and fulsome education. Our efforts have been repeatedly disregarded or met with promises to investigate, with no further action taken while we continue to watch conditions for both students and educators deteriorate. The full report is available on our website, but I'd like to briefly highlight some of the most alarming data we've collected. On the issue of student safety, 50% of parents indicated that they usually or always worry that about their children's safety when they are at school. The most reported safety concerns were bullying, elopement, and violence. Although these numbers are shocking, they did not surprise us. The OAC has been saying for years that it was only a matter of time before a child would be seriously injured or die while at school. Sadly, we saw the passing of Landon Ferris last May when he was left alone in a sensory room for hours. But still, we have seen no action to address safety concerns in schools for vulnerable students. Educators and school staff are left to do the best they can just to keep students with disabilities safe due to chronic staffing shortages and a lack of resources. Often, the only tool they have left in their toolbox is exclusions. When we asked about exclusions, 6% of families reported that their kids were not attending school at all. This is what we refer to as a hard exclusion. What we refer to as soft exclusions have become an even larger problem. Over a third of families responded that their children were being partially excluded from school or some part of their school experience. Soft exclusions take many forms, but what we hear often the most from families are calls to home during the school day saying that the school is unable to support their child and the child must be picked up for the remainder of the day and brought home. Incredibly, there are families that receive these calls multiple times a week. The OAC and other disability advocates have repeatedly requested transparency about the number of exclusions that occur province-wide, but neither the ministry nor school boards seem to be willing to come forward with numbers. In the same vein, 19% of families surveyed reported that their child was on a modified schedule, with 35% of them attending school for only 3 to 5 hours a day. In 38% of the responses, the reason for the modified schedule was that the school lacked the resources to support their child's needs. The last piece of data that I'm going to highlight today is something that we oddly don't discuss anymore when we're discussing special education. Are students with special education needs actually accessing a meaningful education? Unfortunately, the answer is often no, they are not. More than 2/3 of the families reported students were not accessing curriculum consistently at all. And 50% of families feel their children are not receiving a meaningful education. For a government that concentrates on academic outcomes in education, there seems to be little concern for the outcomes of students with disabilities. In conclusion, a clear theme emerges. Special education supports are beyond inefficient. To handle the complex needs in classrooms today, schools are under-resourced and underfunded, and students with disabilities are paying the price. We are looking at a system in crisis that can only get worse as school boards continue to make more cuts that often end up hitting students with disabilities the hardest. Of great concern is the continued move to cut special education classrooms, a move that many school boards say will benefit all students in the name of inclusion, while ignoring the fact that many students with disabilities require alternative learning environments that provide extra support and proper accommodations and programming that is more often than not unavailable in typical classrooms. The Ottawa Carleton District School Board is the latest school board to announce intentions to cut many of their special education classrooms, leaving families pushing back and feeling unheard. Families have painted a picture of a systemic neglect in special education in Ontario, and we are well past the time of being able to pretend that we can ignore it. The time for commitment to equity and access to meaningful and safe education for students with disabilities is now. I'd now like to ask Chandra Pasma to make some remarks.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning. I'm Chandra Pasma, MPP for Ottawa West Nepean and Ontario NDP Education Critic. And I want to thank the Ontario Autism Coalition for the work that they've done in collecting this survey data. The data backs up what parents of children with disabilities and special needs have been saying to this government for years. Their children are not getting the safe, supported, meaningful education that they deserve. The Ford government's cuts to education have been significant. $1,500 per student since 2018. For a school of 400 students, that's $600,000 that's not there anymore. And $600,000 covers a lot of resources. Ford's funding cuts have touched all aspects of education, but time and again, it is our most vulnerable children who have been asked to pay the biggest price. Just think about it for a moment. That half of families of children with special needs are sending their kids to school in the morning worried about their safety. Think how many parents did that just this morning. Half of the families say that their child is not receiving a meaningful education. We have an Education Act in Ontario that says every child has the right to an education. The Ford government is failing these children. They are not getting the education that they have a right to receive. And more than a third of parents say that their child does not feel safe, happy, or supported at school. Just think what that experience is like for these children every single day. What it's like for these parents to send your child off to school in the morning, knowing that it will not be a positive experience for them. It is long past time that the Ford government finally listened to parents, listened to the teachers and education workers and school boards who have been raising these concerns. Nearly every school board in the province is running a deficit in special education. Our schools and the caring adults who work in them want to provide the supports. They are trying to provide the supports, but the funding is just not there. These children deserve an education, a real education, to be safe at school and to be supported and included. We need a government that will do these for these children. And now I'll turn it over to David Lepofsky.
Good morning. I want to thank the Ontario Autism Coalition for inviting me on behalf of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance to share our experience on this issue. In May 2005, the legislature unanimously passed a law that guaranteed that Ontario would become accessible to people with disabilities by 2025, including its education system. But right now we have an education system that is replete with disability barriers, barriers that impede students with disabilities, numbering over 1/3 from getting an equal education, barriers that impede educators who want to educate all kids from being able to effectively serve them. These barriers are all illegal. They violate the Charter of Rights, which guarantees equal protection and equal benefit of the law to people with disabilities. They violate the very first section of the Human Rights Code, which guarantees to everyone equal treatment in services like education without discrimination because of a disability. So the results of the survey, which the Ontario Autism Coalition should be applauded for gathering, come to us as appalling but not surprising. We get the same feedback from across the province from parents of students with disabilities. As well, I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Toronto District School Board. It is the largest school board in Canada. It has 40,000 students with special education needs at least. It is the largest educator of students with disabilities and special education needs in the country. Last November, we held a town hall for parents of students with special education needs, and we asked them two questions. What barriers do your children face? And what can the school board do to better serve those students? The responses were wrenching. I could barely sleep that night. The stories we heard, parents barely holding back their tears and apologizing to us for the fact that they were on the verge of tears, recognizing that educators were trying their best, but saying over and over that their child's disability-related needs were not effectively being met. Now, is this the case for every student in Ontario with a disability? Of course not. But is it the case for too many of them? And the answer is, of course. Well, what do we do about it? One of the solutions, of course, is that we need more provincial funding. It is the province that funds education services. And those of us, either as parents or as advocates, have been finding ourselves, not for years but for decades, caught in an ugly verbal tennis match between school boards that say the province doesn't give them enough and the government of Ontario that says they're giving them more than ever. And all we know is what we hear at meetings like the town hall, which our Special Education Advisory Committee held last fall. But guess what? It's not all about money alone. You see, the problem is, as the school board system and the education system is now being run, the province is leaving it to every single school board, all 72 of them, to decide how much, if anything, they will do to remove the physical barriers, the technology barriers, the curriculum barriers, the attitude barriers that face students with disabilities and their families in their school boards. And to reinvent the wheel, how much to do and how to do it. That is a formula for failure, a formula for making it harder to do it, harder to get it right, and the losers are the kids and their families. Well, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 20 years ago provided a solution. We need a strong education accessibility standard that lays out in detail what school boards need to do and when they need to do it by to remove and prevent disability barriers. We were promised this in December of 2016, and 9 years later, we still don't have one. The government appointed an expert advisory committee called the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Standards Development Committee in 2018, first under the Wynne government, continued under the Ford government. And it rendered a report. I had the privilege of serving on that committee, on an equal representation from the disability community and the education community. We put our heads together and formed a consensus report with a complete roadmap of how to go from an education system full of barriers that treats kids with disabilities as second-class citizens to an education system that is barrier-free and includes all. And it's a cost-sensitive, responsible report. In many ways, it could save money and improve outcomes. We rendered our report on the 28th of January 3 years ago. Not one word of it has been enacted since then. So what's the solution? 2 weeks ago, on the 6th of January, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, in this very room, unveiled to the public our Accessible Ontario Pledge that we are asking all parties to commit to, whether now without an election or if an election is called. We are nonpartisan. We want all the parties to pledge. It includes strong commitments for a barrier-free, properly run education system that serves students with disabilities. So far, we are pleased that the Green Party has made that pledge. We are waiting to hear from the other three parties. But the roadmap is clear. Yes, it needs more resources, but even with the money that the school boards now get, there is so much more that could be done for students with disabilities. If only the schools where they studied were barrier-free rather than full of disability barriers. Now it's over to Laura.
Thank you, David. And thank you to Kate and the entire Ontario Autism Coalition for inviting me here today. And it's a partnership that I have enjoyed for many years, working alongside you as we continue to fight. And as I mentioned, and was mentioned before, I am the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, which represents 1 million workers and 54 unions, including the education unions that are proudly serving our students here in Ontario. But today I want to talk to you as an educational assistant and as a mom. I'm joining you here today following a really good summit by OSSTF yesterday around safe schools. And what shocked me the most as I was reviewing my notes is that the data, whether it's coming from an education worker, teacher perspective, from a parent perspective, from the disability community perspective, the data is the same over and over and over. We are failing our students in Ontario. And I am confident that the response and the rebuttal that we are going to get today from the Ford government is that they are doing unprecedented investments. And I'm simply going to say that that is not true. Those investments are not keeping up with the current costs of providing an education in Ontario. But more than that, and to David's point, that money is not enveloped in a way that truly supports students, families, and the staff that are providing the supports. Simply put, building a school or providing technology is nothing without the actual people that provide the caring supports that our students desperately need. Inclusion without adequate supports is truly exclusion. For close to 7 years, Ford has failed. He has failed to support children and the families who are languishing on wait lists. He's failed to fund and respect education workers, teachers, and the families that we proudly support. We need to get to work. Time has slipped by. So many of these students will be leaving the school system without actually receiving the supports that they are by law entitled to receive. If we would rather spend the time going on campaign trails, I am here to say that the Ontario Federation of Labour will be working closely with the Ontario autism community to ensure that these voices are lifted up and that we are putting in place governments that understand the needs of supporting these students, supporting the families, and clearing those barriers that have been long in existence and far overdue to be removed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are open for questions, and if you could let us know which...
Alan Hale from the Trillium. I appear to be the only reporter here, so I'm going to ask some questions on behalf of my other colleagues as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so in the survey findings, it says that most families have reported that their students' individual education plan accommodations are not being followed consistently. So my question is how easy to fix that? How easy would it be to fix that? Is it just a matter of better communications and more check-ins with parents from the administration, or is this just really only about money? Like, what would actually need to be done to make sure those plans are being followed?
Well, And thank you for asking that question, because that is an important part of our survey. I didn't mention that in my notes because the survey is a long survey, and to mention every single questions, but it would be difficult. But IEPs, or individual education plans, are a very important part of how students who learn differently are able to access a meaningful education that will remove barriers and make them more successful. It's pretty clear that the failures that the parents are reporting on with IEPs is once again a lack of resources. I think educators have the best intentions that IEPs will be created and will be followed. But the reality is, when there's one teacher in the classroom and no EAs, and the teacher has sometimes a dozen kids in their class on IEPs, plus maybe another 20 kids in the class, they're going to have a real struggle to make sure that every item on an IEP is being followed. And that's likely what's happening. What is the answer? Is more educators in the classroom, providing more commitment to make sure that IEPs are being followed.
Can I just add to that? Because I'm going to offer you a slightly different perspective. There's no question that we need more resources, and there is no question that more resources from the province would help. But we don't accept, speaking from the perspective of my coalition, that every school board is using the resources they have now to best advantage. And we don't accept that every teacher who agrees to what's in it, or principal to what's in an individual education plan, has access within the board's existing resources to what they need. Let me give you an example of a solution that would be available now, has been available for years, and that in my capacity as chair of the Toronto District School Board Special Education Advisory Committee, I was appearing and pleading for reforms last night at a meeting of the Toronto District School Board. This is within existing budget. The fact of the matter is, if you are a parent whose child has an individual education plan, and the parent believes that the plan is not being fully complied with, or that there are accommodation needs and supports that the student needs, but they simply are not getting, whether it's in that document or not, there is not a strong, effective, fast avenue available for those parents to try to get that problem solved within their school boards. And I can tell you that from the perspective of our Special Education Advisory Committee, because last October we passed a detailed motion asking for a reform in this area, which I presented to our trustees last night. But also because 3 years ago, the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Standards Development Committee reported the same problem and made similar recommendations to the Government of Ontario. Again, reforms that have led to not a single word enacted to change the status quo. In a nutshell, what's available at school boards is called the Concerned Parents Protocol. And in plain language, you go if you've got a concern about anything at school, not just for students with disabilities and not just about individual education plans, but anything. You go, it could be your kid's not on the soccer team they want to be on. Or your kid didn't get placed with the class, the option, the elective they wanted. It could be anything. They go to the teacher, then they go to the principal, then they go to the superintendent, up the hierarchy. Now, here's the problem. Nobody going up that hierarchy may have specialized experience and expertise in educating students with disabilities. Moreover, the complaint will get swamped in a mass of complaints about other issues, as I said. And third, you're going up a hierarchy that's not independent of the original decision makers. So in a large school board like TDSB, I give it just as an example, it would be so easy to give parents a number to call or an email address to email, where someone who is at the other end of the phone or the email is not only taken a few courses in special education, but they've actually got a lot of experience in the field. And they're not along on the hierarchy that decides the individual complaint or deals with it. They're on the outside. They can give it a second look and see if they can come up with a solution. If they find one, that's great. If they don't, we're at least better off for having tried to narrow the range of problems. Now, this should seem entirely intuitively obvious, but you can't believe the difficulty we get trying to get even experimentation, even trial and error with this. And we don't need more budget, and we don't need more resources in the classroom to solve this problem. Those resources in the classroom and the more budget would help, but I'm not prepared to assume that every one of 72 school boards has made the absolute optimum use of every dollar they get. And therefore there is no room for improvement at the local level. But leaving it to 70 school boards to decide whether this even needs to be fixed, I was trying last night to get TDSB to make it a priority, but try to have to lobby 72 school boards to decide it has to be fixed and that they're going to make it a priority, that is not efficient, effective, or fair to people with disabilities.
David, how do you fix that, though? There are 70 school boards. There's been talk about combining them, but no one's really seriously discussed that. Is that something you would want to see?
Absolutely not. But what we do have is a law that was passed 20 years ago I had the privilege of leading the campaign for. Under the Disabilities Act, the government can pass an accessibility standard that it can enforce that sets out requirements like establishing a more effective, fast, fair method for parents of students with disabilities to try to get these issues resolved. And we recommended that, as I said, 3 years ago. The government, the provincial government, under any premier could do this. And if they wanted to try it out, short of passing a regulation, they could pilot ideas or options within some school boards, see what works, see if some ways of doing it work better than others. There are so many ways they could be doing this within existing budget. And of course, adding new budget can only help more.
Thank you, David. And I think you had a few things you wanted to say on the topic of IEPs.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention that we have crisis upon crisis in our schools because of the underfunding, and those crises are contributing to a shortage of qualified teachers and education workers, regular absences that administrators are trying to fill every day. So we have classrooms that do not have a qualified teacher. We have teachers and education workers who are coming in to fill in for absences who have no time to read the IEP, let alone know how to put it in place, especially when, as Kate says, you could have 10 or 12 students in a class who have an IEP. So we also need to address that teacher and education worker shortage, which means investing in the opportunities for them to receive those qualifications, but also showing teachers and education workers the respect that this government has been lacking, because we have qualified EAs and teachers who have left the system who could come back if we were actually to show them the respect that they deserve and address the working conditions that they're expected to work in every day.
According to the survey, of the students who are on modified schedules, 38% are because the school is lacking the resources to accommodate their needs. And say the government does say that, they'll give the blank check, they'll pay the money that's required to fix that problem. Are the people or the sports actually available to make that change? Where are these? We're talking about people. David was mentioning we need more people with training. Are people with that training really available that we could just, if the money was there and the will was there, we could just ask, we could just find these people? Where?
Yes.
Where are they?
Actually, I can tell you this,
okay.
and this is my lived experience. It's not about a blank check. That is actually the problem that is happening with our funding formula. Our funding formula currently is based on bums and seats and not on needs. We need to really address that. But the other thing is it's not about a blank check that school boards, 72 individual school boards, can use at will. There needs to be fencing around the funding that is coming. That it means that it's going to the actual needs that it needs to serve. Those supports are available. I was at, a Safe Schools Summit just Yesterday, I was, last week at a premiere of Ford High. 40,000 qualified teachers in Ontario are currently not working. And that is because we have created a system that is the working conditions are not bearable. And if you think 40,000 teachers is bad, the number is greater when we talk about educational assistants, when we talk about early childhood educators. What we are finding is that boards are saying just anybody with 2 feet and a heartbeat can come in and do this. Not anyone with 2 feet and a heartbeat can do the work and provide these services that these students need. And it's compounded because it has been ongoing for years and years and years that we have just, picked away. And there's a breaking point that anyone would reach. Quite frankly, when I left as an EA, I was literally timing on my phone every 15 minutes so that I knew that I needed to leave and go and help the next student that I was assigned to. When I started as an EA, I was working with maybe 2 or 3 students a day. When I left as an EA, I was working with 15 to 20. It is not feasible for us to provide the supports. And in my heart, I knew as I was leaving one student, I was leaving them to their own devices. That's the reality of our schools today. It's not about a blank check. It's about providing the services and the supports and the resources where they are needed. Fair doesn't mean that everyone gets everything the same. It means that we give what we need to the people who need it in order for them to be successful. And that is something that we have not seen in the province of Ontario in at least 7 years, going back even further. It must be addressed.
Yeah, if I could add to that, absolutely, Laura. I think what we see in this report, and what we honestly believe, and I think maybe all of us here would agree, there are funding issues, but there's also commitment issues by this government. The government knows and has been told repeatedly that they're failing students with special needs. And they don't seem willing to even try to acknowledge it or come to the table to discuss how they're going to fix it. And it's a serious problem.
Let me offer you 2 very precise examples of where provincial action could make a big difference. And we're not talking about substantial amounts of money. Number 1, I know I keep talking about organizations I'm involved with. I'm going to tell you about a third one. I'm the parent of a child with vision loss, and I normally I try to avoid discussing it in public, but I'm on the board of Ontario Parents of Visually Impaired Children. We have been fighting for over 6 years because there's a crisis shortage of teachers of the visually impaired. They're itinerant teachers who go school to school and teach Braille and adaptive tech that we blind folks need for basic literacy, numeracy, and education. There is a crisis shortage, and the training standards for those who are trained in Ontario are substandard for at least half of the country. And I can tell you I've been involved with CNIB and this parents organization I'm involved with, I'm on the board of, with the Ministry of Education for upwards of 6 years or longer, at least 6 years, trying to get them to intervene and generate a strategy to get properly trained teachers of the visually impaired. Now, we're talking small numbers because there is a very small number of blind and low vision kids in school in Ontario. This is not a hard one to fix, but we have still seen no action after meeting, after meeting, after apology, after apology. It's not rocket science. Others could do it better. When I go to the States and see what's done in this field, I feel like I've traveled into the future. Let me give you one other very simple solution. This study brings again to light the fact that principals have this arbitrary, unfair, excessive power to just refuse to admit a student to school. And on the face of the legislation, they don't have to set a timeline or even give reasons. You heard Kate talk about what it's done as a hard exclusion, a formal statement, or more informally just, parent, please pick your kid up and maybe don't bring them back until we tell you you can. Now, the Ministry of Education apparently was looking, the Kindergarten Grade 12 Standards Development Committee had detailed recommendations on how this should be reformed. Again, 3 years later, nothing enacted to change that. You could look at the meeting of the Toronto District School Board Special Education Advisory Committee from a week and a half ago that I chaired and see what happens when we just try to get answers out of senior board staff of exactly what the numbers are that we're talking about. But the Ministry of Education, apparently we got from rumor last month, was looking at holding a meeting to discuss with some community groups or whoever a possible new memo from the ministry to tell school boards how to manage and use this power. Well, that would be a real step forward. We weren't invited, the AODA Alliance, even though we've done advocacy on this. The Toronto District School Board wasn't invited. I wrote to the ministry and said, hey, can we come? And all we've heard back on this, other than acknowledging the email, is that the meeting was canceled or postponed to an as yet undetermined future date. This is, like, it's hard to do worse.
Good point.
Okay. Given that you guys are arguing it's not necessarily about more money, maybe more about structure and like rules, shouldn't the government be more receptive to that? Like they're already saying, as you pointed out, that they're spending historic amounts of money on special education. If it's not necessarily all about more money, would you hope that the PCs would be more responsive to like structural reform, that things you're talking about?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the government is directly responsible for Ontario's provincial schools, which serve children with disabilities. There is no elected school board between the government and the English provincial schools. And what we are seeing is that those provincial schools are failing kids with disabilities even more than the publicly elected school boards are. So this government is not a government that can be trusted to put structures or measures in place that will actually protect children against abuse, discrimination, or neglect. And they cannot be trusted to put measures in place that will actually provide these children with a meaningful education. And sadly, that's just one area in which we see this government failing people with disabilities of all ages in Ontario. They're not providing therapy for kids with autism. They're not providing income support that's meaningful for people with disabilities. They're not funding services and residential placements for people with developmental disabilities. This is part of an overall pattern of neglect by this government. They cannot be counted on to put in place structures that will meaningfully protect children with disabilities in our schools and provide them with the education they deserve.
Right.
And I'm just going to, your question suggested it's not money. It's both. Mm-hmm. So in other words, a non-money based reforms like the some of the structural reforms and the basic fairness measures that the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Standards Development Committee recommended 3 years ago, we need that. We also need more funding, so they can't excuse one with the other. The government announced, last year, I think, that they're spending another $1 billion or something on more schools. Great. We, in our committee, provided 3 years ago 20 pages of detail on how to design a school building so it's barrier-free, and designs that, if you build it at the outset, could in some way save you money, rather than building new schools that will have more barriers and then have to pay a lot more money to retrofit them later. So far, we've written the government over, or we've publicly stated that they should make this a requirement for new school construction, and as far as we've seen, they have not.
Last question is, there's likely to be an election, probably called next week. We've sort of heard Laura say that you're going to work with the autism community on making to get their voices heard during the election. And we've heard David talk about he wants a pledge from the different parties, and we've only heard at the Greens so far. But is that your whole plan, or is there something else that you plan to do this election to make sure that this is not lost in the shuffle? Because the PCs are obviously hoping that they are going to cruise to an easy victory.
I think it's incumbent on every single one of us to be out and speaking, not just on social media, not just through a tweet, not just through an ad, but talking in our communities. You know, we've done polling at the Ontario Federation of Labour. We know that affordability is a number one concern. There is an affordability crisis for these families. When you are talking about your student being excluded, you aren't working if you have to be home with your child. Let us be very clear. So it's about cutting through this din and actually going out and talking about, are we better off under our current system? And how collectively, as people in our community, can we lift each other up to ensure that the government that takes, you know, whether it's June 2026 or it's March 2025, that we are actually putting a government in place that is working for the people of Ontario. We call it building the Ontario we need. And quite frankly, I think we're long overdue for an Ontario that the people of Ontario need. And I think what we're seeing right now is after 7 years of what we've had, none of us, whether we're speaking from the disability community, whether we're speaking from the autism community, from the labor community, I have yet to meet anyone who has said, yep, I'm doing much better than I was 7 years ago today. And so I am calling on every single person in Ontario. It's time for us to get out and talk and bring a friend to the polls and make your voice heard. Because we do know what happens when we have the lowest voter turnout rate in Ontario. You and I both know. And I think, that's something that, we're all hoping that if there's an election, nobody's going to get out and canvass because it's cold. We're Canadian. We can put on a toque and some mitts. We can get out there and do that. And I'm calling on every single person. The time is now. These are our friends. These are our families. These are our neighbors. And we need to collectively step forward, move forward, and do better.
I'm just going to say one quick thing. We're not partisan. We don't try to elect or defeat anyone. The AOD Alliance is who I'm speaking for. Our goal is to get the strongest commitments out of each party, and we're prepared to work with any party. We're issuing an invitation to all parties right now to that haven't signed the Accessible Ontario Pledge, that we'd be happy to brief them and discuss with them. But in terms of our strategy, our coalition or its predecessor have been active in raising disability issues in every provincial election since 1995. And there's a pattern we've noticed, and we're going to see if we can make a dent in changing it. And respectfully, it's a pattern that emanates from the media, the mainstream media. What we find that happens as soon as a writ drops is that the media gives more coverage to provincial issues or to the provincial politics than ever, but less coverage to most issues than ever. That what happens is some of the pundits or bureau chiefs decide that there's one or two or three election issues, that it'll be, Trump or the economy or whatever. And they're free to do that, of course. But what happens is when you listen to their punditry and their horse race coverage, that's all they talk about. And so 2.9 million people with disabilities who were failed by an Accessibility Act that was promised to them, that made a legislative unanimous promise to them, they may never talk about unless we are effective at getting change in journalistic coverage. Now, we believe there's a new generation of journalists out there who are more interested in these issues than ever. And we respect that senior pundits have a lot of experience in covering these issues and draw on that experience. But we will be, and no one's a bad person in this. They've just got old patterns, and we've seen them. We're going to see if we can shake that up a bit and get more media ready to cover more issues that affect voters than just the 3 or 4 that it usually gets distilled to.
Thank you, David. I can tell you from the Ontario Autism Coalition's perspective, we are a political advocacy group. We are very motivated politically to make sure that our membership is out asking the questions of people who are trying to get elected to office. This report, I think, is indicative of some big, large issues. And we are going to arm our membership of families and supporters with the information and the questions that they need to be asking when the election campaign is happening. We are nonpartisan by nature, but this government has some big questions to answer. They have made promises they have not they have not followed through with. And our children are being left behind, and that's seriously problematic. So we will absolutely be active if the writ is dropped, and looking for more explanations, more answers, and more positive future, we hope.
Okay.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.